Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy McLeaf, and I'm a biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service at the National Conservation Training Center. I'm glad you could join us today for our August installment of the Monarch Conservation Webinar Series. Here to introduce our topic today, presenters, is Wendy Caldwell from the Monarch Joint Venture.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. I'm Wendy Caldwell, as Tracy noted, and I'm the coordinator of the Monarch Joint Venture. I'm also joined by Shelby, who is our education assistant. Today's webinar is about monarchs and roadsides and is brought to you by the following presenters. Karen Oberhauser is a professor in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology at the University of Minnesota. She and her students conduct research on several aspects of monarch butterfly ecology. Her research depends on traditional lab and field techniques, as well as contributions of a variety of audiences through citizen science. Jennifer Hopwood is a senior pollinator conservation specialist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and she provides resources and training for pollinators and beneficial insect habitat management, creation, and restoration. Jennifer has authored a number of publications and articles, including a literature review about roadsides and their potential to act as habitat for pollinators. Ken Graeve works with the Minnesota Department of Transportation, providing technical support for roadside vegetation management. His work areas include rare plant reviews, vegetation establishment during construction, invasive species control, and prescribed fire. Last, Kyle Kasten is a graduate of Carleton College who started working with the monarch habitat monitoring along roadsides in 2015 through a position with AmeriCorps. Now, with the University of Minnesota, Kyle is managing a number of monarch habitat evaluation projects across different habitat types. If any questions come up during today's presentation, Shelby and I will be monitoring the chat box where we encourage you to ask those questions. At the end of the presentations, we'll have a question and answer period where we'll moderate questions that you've asked throughout the presentation. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Karen to get us started.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks for joining us, everybody. It's really exciting to be presenting this topic to you. So we're going to be talking about the importance of roadsides for monarch butterfly conservation, and I'm going to kind of kick us off here by really kind of setting the stage and saying, why do we really care about roadside habitat? So the two things that I'll talk about are, first, are monarchs threatened? Why are we really looking at increasing the amount of habitat for monarchs on the ground? And secondly, if monarchs are threatened, how do we set conservation targets to recover populations? A lot of times we think about habitat like the slide shown, or the picture shown in the middle here, wide open spaces with lots of milkweed. But what I hope you'll come away with from my introduction here is that we really need all of the habitat that we can get to preserve monarchs, and this includes roadside habitat. So first of all, how do we know monarchs are declining? We know because most of the monarchs, at least in the eastern migratory population, gather together in wintering sites in Mexico. And we can assess the size of the population of these monarchs by looking at the number of hectares that they cover on the ground. So basically, we're talking about the number of hectares that are covered with trees that are covered like monarchs, that, like you see in the picture on the right. And it doesn't take a degree in statistics to see that this number is declining, that we're seeing a downward trend in the number of monarchs over time. So here's a little arrow showing that trend. And what we've done to understand what the risk is to monarchs is something called an extinction risk analysis. And this tells us the risk that the population has of actually reaching a number that's so low that they won't be able to recover. And a paper that was recently published estimates the chances that monarch populations will get to a low enough level. And what we do in these models is consider the overall population growth rate. So how is the population on average changing from year to year? And then what is the year-to-year variation in these numbers? And the reason that I have a slide here of a lot of dead monarchs is this is one of the things that causes year-to-year variation. So probably most of the people listening to this call know that in March of this year, even though we had had a little bit of uptick in the number of monarchs in the overwintering sites, there was a big storm that killed a large proportion of these butterflies. So we get these stochastic events that cause big changes in the population. And we use this population growth rate and the year-to-year variation to establish a target population size that we use for conservation planning. And with this busy table right here, I'm showing you what the risks are of extinction, basically the population shrinking so low that it won't be able to recover if we have different starting population sizes. So if you look over, here's my little arrow, at these numbers right here, these are what we call extinction thresholds. So we don't know how low the monarch population can shrink before it will not be able to be recovered. But we got a bunch of biologists together and thought, well, maybe 0.01 hectares. So these values are in hectares. 0.01, just to kind of give you a context, is about one tree, and 0.25 is about a little over half an acre. So these are what we thought might be reasonable extinction thresholds. And then we looked out over 10 and 20 years and projected the risk that the population would actually get to one of these extinction thresholds. And the numbers that I've highlighted here are the risks if we have 6 hectares of monarchs. And you can see that we have a 25% chance. So this number right at the bottom means that we have a 25% chance of reaching 0.25 hectares in a 20-year time frame. So conservation biologists chose 6 hectares because we think that this is a low enough number that this is our goal, so 6 hectares. So then what we've done is thought, how much milkweed do we need to get to these 6 hectares? So we just took 6 hectares times the number of monarchs in Mexico per hectare times the number of milkweeds that it takes to produce a monarch. I'm losing my little arrow here. Okay. Oh, well. And that's our milkweed target. So then we take our milkweed target, subtract the amount of milkweed that's on the ground right now, and come up with a goal for how much milkweed we need. And we've estimated, oh, here's my arrow, that we need 1.4 billion more stems to reach our target population of 6 hectares. So this is just milkweed, but we always need to remember that we need nectar sources as well. So then we've looked at where we can get this land. Where can we put 1.4 billion more stems of milkweed into the ground? So we looked at how much land could come from all of these different categories that are listed here, and they're listed in increasing order. So we can get the least amount of land from urban and suburban spaces, basically where we live, work, and play, and the most from agricultural lands. But you can see here, right in the middle, we have rights of ways, which are mostly roadsides. So that's why roadsides are really important, because we need them to reach our goal to get to 1.4 billion stems. So the other important thing about roadsides is they provide connectivity. And this is just a picture. As you can see, it's a map from the center of Iowa, kind of the center of monarch country. And you can see that there are a lot of roadsides here spread out over the landscape. You can also see that Highway 35, a lot of people are talking about Highway 35 corridor. That is very, very small. So really what we're talking about when we talk about roadsides is all of these other roadsides. We need milkweed habitat on all of these gray and black and red lines. We really don't get a lot from the interstates. So the rest of the speakers will be talking about what are some of the opportunities and risks posed by roadside habitat. So I'll turn that over to Jennifer in just a second. And then Ken will be talking about roadside management And then Kyle is going to fill us in on the current state of milkweed in roadsides. So you can take it away now, Jennifer.
All right, thank you very much. As Karen mentioned, I'll be talking about the risks associated with roadsides as habitat for monarchs and potential opportunities. What I'm going to be covering today can be found in more detail in the 3 documents pictured on your screen. The first document on the left is a literature review. Is volume okay? I'm feeling like my technology is a little bit shaky at the moment. Xerces was part of a team along with ICF International that worked with Federal Highways Administration to summarize the available research and summarize it in a literature review. And then we consulted with roadside practitioners and roadside managers and summarized the science and synthesized their input into 2 sets of best management practices. And we'll provide the links for those documents at the end of the presentation. But I'm going to start out focusing on some of the unique threats associated with roads that monarchs face. Roads cause monarch mortality, for example, due to traffic and collisions with vehicles. We really know very little about the scale at which roads cause monarch mortalities. There's one study from Illinois, for example, that indicates that more monarchs might be killed during the peak of fall migration, but we really don't know about the percentage of the population that's using the roadsides, how many of those monarchs are killed by vehicles. Extrapolating from what we do know about other butterflies and how their mortality rates are influenced by roads and other factors, we surmise that monarch mortality rates are increased by traffic volume. The larger the number of vehicles that pass on the road, the more monarchs are going to be killed. And the wider the roads can also impact butterfly mortality. But roadside vegetation management can also impact mortality rates. So roadsides that are mown more frequently, for example, have higher rates of butterfly mortality. Conversely, mortality rates of butterflies are decreased by roadsides that are wider in width, that are larger, and that roadsides that have higher rates of plant diversity. So in contrast to a concern that's really been raised recently about the idea that if we are increasing wildflower diversity on roadsides, that we might be drawing in butterflies and other pollinators and increasing rates of mortality by putting them in closer proximity to vehicles, the current research really indicates that the opposite is true, that as we increase the quality of roadside habitat, we're actually decreasing mortality rates due to vehicles. Other threats associated with roads include the proximity and exposure to road salts, particularly in states that need to use road salts in order to keep roads safe for drivers. That sodium runs off onto the vegetation and can increase the sodium content of plants close to the road. For monarchs, this can have implications because milkweeds closer to the road have higher sodium content. And we don't really know very much about the effects of that. There's one study that indicates that at moderate levels of exposure, monarchs have increased muscle mass and increased brain development, but at higher levels of sodium, likely the effects become more detrimental. So we'll have to stay tuned for additional research on that topic. And then roadside vegetation management can have a significant impact on the quality of the roadsides for monarch butterflies. Mowing, for example, can kill caterpillars on host plants. It can temporarily remove floral resources in host plants. But over time, the implications of mowing can be more significant by reducing the quality of wildflower diversity and abundance. For herbicides, similar impacts can occur. The blanket use of herbicides can remove host plants from monarchs and temporarily remove nectar sources, but over time, repeated use of herbicides can weaken stands of vegetation and can reduce the diversity and abundance of wildflowers, which can have indirect impacts on monarchs. Aside from all of these threats, and despite all of these threats, roads are really a part of our landscape. They're really essential to our transportation system. And so we really need to start thinking about opportunities to reduce impacts of roads. And right now the science indicates that ways we can reduce impacts of roads to monarchs include how we manage the roadside, the vegetation of the roadside. And changing that roadside vegetation management can be a significant conservation opportunity. As Karen mentioned, roadsides extend through all different landscapes and provide connectivity between all different landscapes. And in some landscapes, they are the only semi-natural or natural habitat that remains for monarch butterflies. They can provide nectar plants and they can provide host plants, and they can help monarchs move through landscapes. So with that in mind, I want to switch gears and talk a little bit about some of the best management practices that were identified by roadside practitioners as opportunities to increase the quality of roadside habitat for monarch butterflies. First and foremost, it's really important to protect and manage existing roadside habitat. In many cases, there are milkweeds already growing on roadsides, and there are seed banks of wildflowers in roadsides, and by managing existing roadsides to support and increase plant diversity, particularly wildflower diversity, it's a significant opportunity to enhance habitat for monarch butterflies. So whether this is through a carefully timed mowing or through targeted invasive species removal, or maybe through a prescribed burn, or even interseeding additional wildflowers, managing what exists is a really important key step. And with that in mind, mowing and reducing the impact of mowing has been identified by vegetation managers as really the most straightforward and important step that can be undertaken to increase wildflowers. Often there are wildflowers present on roadsides, and by reducing mowing and considering the timing of mowing, that allows wildflowers to bloom and to produce seeds and to continue to proliferate over time. So research indicates that it's important to limit mowing to no more than twice a growing season in order to maximize wildflower diversity. From the perspective of monarchs utilizing that habitat, it's a good idea for roadside managers to consider delaying mowing until fall to allow monarch butterflies to reproduce during the breeding season and to allow migrating monarchs to take advantage of nectar sources throughout the growing season. That isn't possible in all states, especially states that have to, for example, switch gears and get ready to manage roadsides in the wintertime. And with that in mind, there are a couple other considerations for timing mowing. A Monarch joint venture has a publication on this specifically, and we'll provide the link at the end of the talk today. This is a management window graphic that they have developed based on data that indicates when monarchs are breeding in different parts of the eastern United States, and then when they move through to move either moving north in the springtime or moving south in the fall. So in Omaha, Nebraska, where I'm based, let me find my arrow here. Recommended mowing might be before May 1st or after October, or there's a window in early July in which the impacts of mowing would be reduced on monarch butterflies. In addition to reducing the impacts of mowing, reducing the impacts of herbicides is really an important step. And that really means in practice keeping applications of herbicides on target, so using specialized equipment to target just weeds rather than using a broadcast spray to spray all the vegetation. It also means using selective herbicides whenever possible and timing applications of herbicides when weeds are most vulnerable to really take advantage of the weeds' vulnerability to strike them down. And it also means that roadside managers can really benefit from having training that helps them recognize native plants. It can be easy to mistake some native plants for weeds. For example, on the screen here, this is tall thistle. It's a native species of thistle, and it's easily mistaken for many noxious thistles, invasive thistles, which are really detrimental to habitat. But it's a really important nectar source for monarch butterflies coming through northeast Nebraska. It's really their number one choice for nectar in the fall. So it's incredibly important to have in the landscape, but it's often mistaken for a weed. And training that helps roadside managers recognize the difference between weeds and valuable plants is really key. So those are all tools that can be used to manage existing habitat to help enhance it for monarchs. But when roadsides need to be revegetated following construction, it's important to prioritize the use of native plants. Those are plants that monarchs benefit from in particular, selecting flowering plants that have sequential and overlapping bloom times so that there are nectar sources available from spring, summer, and fall, and of course including milkweeds as host plants and other butterfly host plants when it's appropriate. To prioritize new plantings, it's a good idea to focus on wider roadsides in particular to maximize habitat quality and to focus on those roadsides that are not going to be subject to pesticide drift. And I want to end by just a quick reminder that change on roadsides can happen at multiple scales. We have freeways, highways, county roads, state roads, townships, streets, and dirt roads in the U.S., and all of these roadsides are an opportunity to provide habitat for monarch butterflies. In some cases, there are milkweeds already on the roadside, and by reducing mowing, for example, in our rural road ditch, this is the road ditch in front of my house in Michigan when I lived there previously, and by just reducing mowing, it allowed milkweed to proliferate. So change like that can be important, as well as change at a state level or at a federal level. And with that, I'll turn it over to Ken. Thank you.
So we've heard about some of the possibilities and risks for relying on roadsides to provide monarch habitat. I'd like to give you a perspective from someone who's involved in roadside vegetation management. The first thing to know is that roadsides are a critical part of our highway infrastructure. We manage them for a few really important primary functions. Monarch habitat is not one of those primary functions that we're managing for. Having said that, though, it's important to know that roadsides have a lot of secondary benefits, including habitat, and those secondary benefits can be quite compatible with those primary functions that we're managing for. So, you know, one of the first critical functions that we're managing for is basically drainage. That roadside is there to make sure that the water drains away from the road, so it doesn't create a safety hazard, and so it doesn't deteriorate the road surface itself. In this photo, you can see, of course, what could happen if we didn't have roadsides with vegetation. That road infrastructure, of course, would be in serious jeopardy. So, the first thing, that roadside needs to drain water away, and it needs to drain it away without taking the soil with it. The next most important thing, I mean, both of these are critical, the next important thing we're managing for on roadsides is safety. So we need something to hold that soil in place, and so we grow grass. We grow grass instead of trees because one of the safety functions of a roadside is to provide a safe, clear zone, space where if a vehicle runs off the road, they can come to a stop without hitting a tree and someone getting injured. The other important safety thing with roadsides is just sight lines. That mowing along the shoulder that you see there, you see it all over the country, is to keep sight lines open so drivers can see if there is a deer or something coming, so drivers have room to pull over if they have an emergency or need to change a tire. And you see this more at corners and along curves, so drivers can see around the curve or across the corner to see if there's approaching traffic. So, those are some pretty basic functions that we're typically managing for. But in order to manage for those functions, the roadside, it doesn't have to look like this one. This is a real common sight, just a vast expanse, mile after mile, of introduced cool season grasses without very many forbs in them. It's kept pretty clean and weed-free often, and so you don't see much diversity. However, there are a lot of secondary benefits that we can manage for. The roadsides won't look the same, but they'll still be accomplishing our primary benefits, but they'll be providing a lot more. So some of those other benefits of roadsides are invasive species control. Roadsides don't have to simply drain that water away from the road and get rid of it. They can also clean it. So we can have roadsides that provide good filtration and infiltration for that stormwater. That's really important in Minnesota and in a lot of places. But in Minnesota, we think about that a lot because being the land of 10,000 lakes, a state with the headwaters of one of the world's major rivers, we pay a lot of attention to water quality, and roadsides have a role to play in that. Aesthetics is another important benefit. It's often thought of as not really important, but if you think about people traveling places, that roadside is what they're seeing the most of. It's kind of it's often people's biggest exposure to the natural world, really. Everywhere they go, they're using a car, and every time they drive, they're seeing what's on the side of the road. And in places that rely on tourism and outdoor recreation, having a roadside that looks attractive is a lot more likely to give people a positive experience, and they're a lot more likely to come back. Another benefit of roadside vegetation is simply health. There are studies that show that well-vegetated roadsides actually reduce people's stress response. There are studies showing that roadside vegetation improves air quality. And so, we initially talked about roadsides for safety, but they're also important for long-term health too, surprisingly. And then biodiversity is a really important benefit of roadsides. And we're talking about monarch habitat, but a lot of roadsides around the country are home to prairie remnants or other remnant plant communities. And in some places, they're the only habitat left in a given area, especially in the intensively agricultural areas. And there are several in Minnesota that are home to some of the only populations of rare plant species in the state. And I imagine that's true in other states as well, where especially roadsides that have remnant prairies adjacent to railroads will find rare plant species that maybe only occur in a few other places in the state, or in some cases in one case we have the only population of one rare plant species on a roadside, and in another case the only population, at least in one region of the state, is on roadsides. So they're really important for just biodiversity in that sense, but then if we look beyond the remnant prairies themselves, those roadside remnants, and look at plantings, then they can be really important for biodiversity in terms of providing habitat for monarchs and other pollinators and other wildlife. And the thing is that, like I said before, these side benefits, they're not usually thought of as part of the job of someone working for a road authority or a Department of Transportation or a public works crew. They don't even have to think of them as part of their job, because if they're managing their roadsides well for those safety benefits and those stormwater benefits, they can use native vegetation to do that. It's going to perform better at infiltration. It's going to perform better at safety. In some cases, it's going to perform better at invasive species control. And at the same time as doing a better job of those primary benefits, it'll improve all the secondary benefits as well. So just kind of to show you how we're not intentionally managing for habitat, but that it's really compatible with what we do. I want to show you, I want to use our seed mix design as an example. So our seed mixes have a lot of different species in them, our native seed mixes. And here's an example. We have warm season grasses. Here's a clump of little blue stem right here. Those warm season grasses are in there because they provide really good erosion control, really good soil stability. They're really drought tolerant because they have those deep roots, and so they'll hold up to a lot of the harsh conditions that a roadside environment can throw at a plant. But at the same time, those bunch grasses are often really good habitat for ground nesting bees, because when you have bunch grasses, you also have small areas of bare soil in between where ground nesting bees can burrow. We have a lot of legumes in our seed mixes. So here's some prairie clover right there, purple prairie clover. We have those in there because we want that nitrogen fixation so that roadside vegetation can be more self-sustaining and can do its job for longer with fewer inputs. And so while we have that in there to serve those primary roadside functions more effectively, those legumes are often really good nectar and pollen sources for pollinators. And then we have lots of different forbs. We have some forbs in our seed mixes, like this black-eyed Susan, that are there because they're early succession plants, and they come in quickly when we first plant. And if that seed is still around in the seed bank, they allow that planting to recover quickly if there's any kind of disturbance, like excessive mowing or drought conditions, or a vehicle runs off the road and causes rutting. Plants like that are there to come back in. And then we have other forbs that are just there because they're really tough, really tough species that can handle harsh conditions, like this blue vervain, or hoary vervain in this case. And so we have lots of different species of each of those, just to provide redundance and resilience, so that if this seed lands in an area that's wetter than we expected, there are still some species that will grow. Or if we get a drier year than expected, other species will fill in. Just typical principles of ecological restoration we're using in our seed mixes, because they give us a more resilient and more functional roadside. But by having all those different species in there, they're also providing lots of different food sources for pollinators, monarchs included, and because we have a lot of different species, there are flowers blooming all year round. And then milkweed is, of course, a perfectly applicable example here. Milkweed is a really tough plant. That's why it has weed in the name. And so it serves as roadside functions really well. It's got often thick roots that help improve soil structure when combined with the fibrous roots of grasses. And it also happens to be the monarch butterfly host plant. And so again, we're doing these. Our seed mix design shows how we're managing roadsides with one goal in mind. But if we do that well, we can serve those other functions as well. One thing I'd like to talk about is invasive species control. So invasive species control, which usually means spraying weeds, is often criticized as harmful to monarchs and other pollinators. But I think it's really important on roadsides, because roadsides are they're a serious vector for invasive species, and invasive species can deteriorate pollinator habitat on the roadsides themselves by crowding out other wildflowers. And then once they spread down the road, they will spread into adjacent lands, and they can cause a lot more habitat degradation beyond the roadside. And so it's really important that we control them on the roadside before, first of all, just to improve the habitat of the roadside itself, but more importantly, to prevent more widespread habitat degradation. The thing is that one common misconception is that herbicides get confused with insecticides, and they're not the same thing. Most herbicides are of course not designed to kill insects, and so they're actually very few of them are very toxic to insects. So they're not usually hurting monarchs directly. However, they, like as Jennifer pointed out, they do kill wildflowers if they're applied if they're over-applied, or even in some cases, in order to spray the weeds, we will have some off-target damage and kill some wildflowers. And so they reduce that food source. And so it's important that we use them carefully. The thing with invasive species control is if we do it well, we are going to have some short-term impacts to habitat. The key is to balance that with the long-term benefits that we get from reduced infestations and improved habitat. Another thing I'd like to clarify a little bit is mowing. A lot of states, at least in the Midwest, have mowing laws or some other guidance that in general is intended to protect ground nesting birds. Usually it's game birds, pheasants and quail. And because that was their original goal of protecting those ground nesting birds, those rules for mowing typically say to wait until mid to late summer. In Minnesota, it's August. We have a mowing law that it restricts mowing outside of the month of August. The problem with that is, it does, our mowing law and others, they do have exceptions for mowing for safety reasons or mowing for weed control or mowing for managing native plantings. However, a lot of people don't see that, and so the law kind of gets oversimplified, and that oversimplification ends up taking the form of, since we can only mow during August, we better mow in August. And so there's a lot of mowing that gets done in August. It's the worst possible time to mow for invasive species control because it spreads a lot of weeds. It's a really bad time to mow for monarch caterpillars because that's when they're hatching out. And so that misunderstanding, I think, leads to a lot of problems. That doesn't mean that it has to stay that way. We can do the education and outreach we need to make sure that we have smarter mowing. Haying is another problem on a lot of roadsides. In that, I'm not entirely sure how the mowing laws apply to haying in other states. It's not really covered under the mowing law in Minnesota. And so there's a lot of haying that gets done throughout the summer, regardless of the timing. And so that leads to a lot more habitat degradation. So that's kind of an ongoing problem. However, with problems like that, like mowing, with balancing the invasive species control impacts with its benefits, there still are a lot of opportunities for roadsides. In Minnesota, we have 175,000 acres of green space on roadsides for state and federal highways. There are similar figures for many other states where it's in the neighborhood of at least 100,000, often more, and that's just on state and federal highways. There are many more acres when you look at county and township roads as well. Some really encouraging trends are that many states are increasing the use of native vegetation. There's a lot more public interest, awareness of pollinator habitat, a lot more awareness of the importance of invasive species control, which can protect a lot of habitat if it's done well. One thing I would like people to remember going forward, though, is this is something that Jennifer alluded to also, and that is that people look at roadsides as a potential solution to the monarch habitat problem, and they think we should be planting a whole bunch of roadsides. And while when we do have the opportunity to plant, we should use native vegetation, but we also have hundreds of miles of roadsides with either remnant native plant communities that are really good habitat or native plantings that we've already done that are pretty good habitat. And most of those hundreds of miles are getting degraded. And so it would be a lot more beneficial to put resources into improving what we have already rather than starting from scratch with new revegetation projects. So with all of those opportunities, there's a lot of benefit that roadsides can provide. We just need to keep in mind that they are being managed for a few particular functions first. It's just a matter of making sure that we manage for those functions in a way that also allows for a lot of secondary benefits. With that, I'll turn it over to Kyle. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Ken. I think that leads very well into my portion of the talk. I'll be speaking on a study that I conducted last summer looking at milkweed density, diversity, and abundance in roadsides, as well as monarch use of these habitats. This is a picture of me on one of my roadside sites, so you get a little idea of what most of them look like. Much like the pictures Ken showed, there is a swath of vegetation between the roadside and then the land that's actually being used next to it, and this was the area that I sampled in. So we selected a 250-mile radius of Minneapolis, Minnesota, and within this radius we selected 500 random sites, and these sites excluded areas in urban and heavily forested areas. You'll notice in the northeastern portion of what would be the radius, there are no dots on this map, and that's because this area of Minnesota and Wisconsin is heavily forested and thus not ideal monarch habitat. Now, I did mention we excluded urban areas, but we did include suburban areas. In an urban setting, there might not be vegetation next to a sidewalk or something like that, but in a more suburban setting, people like to have wild spaces near them, so we thought this might be a good candidate for having milkweed habitat. So suburban areas were included. Each site here represents 5 different transects that were spaced 1 mile apart. Each transect that I ran was 50 meters long and covered the full width of the roadside, so width was variable depending on how wide the roadside was constructed. We sampled from the 20th of July until October 15th in 2015, and because of this time constraint, we weren't able to get to all 500 sites. We reached 212 of them, and these were selected based on their proximity to each other in order to create or to have driving distances that were more efficient. So as I mentioned, the main focus of the study was to determine milkweed presence on roadsides. And the main finding was that we found at least 1 milkweed plant on 59.5% of transects sampled. So that number is here at the bottom. The overwhelming dominant species was Asclepias syriaca, otherwise known as common milkweed, and we found this was this represented 97.1% of all the milkweeds that we found on roadsides. Asclepias syriaca was found on 57.8% of all roadsides sampled. But, however, we did find a total of 7 different species, and this diversity suggests that Asclepias syriaca is not the only species that is capable of growing in roadsides, but these other species are candidates for roadside growth as well. This is a graph showing milkweed density ranges of Asclepias syriaca when we found it on roadsides. So the x-axis shows different series of density ranges going from anything greater than 0 up to our highest category, which was 0.8 stems per meter squared. So again, I'll reiterate, this does not include all of the sites where we did not find milkweed, but only the sites where milkweed was found. As you can see, milkweed was generally found in quite low densities, ranging from less than 0.001 stems per meter squared. However, the upper end of the densities could reach over 5 plants per meter squared. As a little anecdote, one roadside that I went to, I found over 1,200 plants in one 50-meter swath, so an astronomically high amount of plants. However, I think this is also illustrated in this graph. There was a great variety of densities, and this could vary from one site. Again, that site that I found 1,200 species at, or 1,200 plants at, the site that was just 1 mile down the road, I found 0 plants. So that illustrates the patchiness that we often see with milkweed distribution. Now, another aspect we were trying to study was the immature density, the immature monarch density on roadsides. And in order to do this, we wanted to compare roadsides to MLMP sites. Now, the MLMP is the Monarch Larva Monitoring Project. It is a citizen science project that we run out of the Monarch Lab here at the University of Minnesota. It asks volunteers to go out into nearby parks, gardens, or open spaces and monitor milkweed for evidence of monarch larvae and eggs. This monitoring is conducted on a weekly basis, and because of this monitoring frequency, it was an ideal candidate to compare our roadside data to. So that's exactly what this graph shows. On the on the left of the paired column graph, you will see roadsides in the solid black color, and the striped represents the MLMP sites. Now, the black stars note when there was a significant difference between the larval density in roadsides and MLMP sites. And you will notice that the majority of the black stars appear over weeks where the MLMP density was significantly higher than roadside density. However, the presence of fifth instars in roadsides do suggest that roadsides are able to support monarch growth from egg until fifth instar and then supposedly to adult, to pupation and adult butterflies. I will also point out that in the week of the 13th of July, right here, and in the week of the 27th of July, we had higher monarch larval densities in roadsides or comparable monarch larval densities in roadsides to MLMP sites, again suggesting that these roadsides in peak monarch season could be providing very significant habitat for the larvae. Oh, I'll go back one more, sorry. You will notice that this graph cuts off on the 7th of September, and that's just due to the monarch population shifting from breeding behavior to migratory behavior. So as the season goes on, you'll see less and less larvae. The last monarch larva that we saw was on the 9th of September, so that would have been in the week of 7th of September there. We also wanted to determine if there might be an effect of the land adjacent to the roadside. And for thought experiment here, you can think maybe of a roadside next to an agricultural field might be affected by some of the variables we've talked about already, such as herbicide or pesticide drift. If the roadside is next to a heavily human-populated area, perhaps there are effects of human activity on whether or not monarchs will use this area. And then monarch use of roadside could also be affected by the availability of habitat other than that roadside. So we really wanted to flesh out if there were specific adjacent land types that favored monarch presence. So on the left column of this graph, you can see the number of the variables that we put into our model, and the star will denote a variable that was significantly correlated with a higher monarch larval density. The intercept that we have here is adjacent prairie type, adjacent habitat type prairie. We thought this would be a good baseline as this is the monarch's natural habitat. Now, I'll point out that there were significant correlations between milkweed density and monarch larval density. That goes without saying. If you don't have milkweed on a roadside, you will absolutely not have monarchs. The other one that I'll point out is day of year. This goes back to what I was saying about the monarch behavioral shift from breeding to migratory behavior. As the year goes on, you will see less and less monarchs. Now, I'll point your attention to two adjacent habitat types that were significantly correlated with higher amounts of, or one was significantly correlated, and the other one trended towards being correlated with higher larval densities. The first is a adjacent habitat type forest. You can see that is significant at a 0.05 alpha level, and the corn-soy fields were trending towards significance at a 0.07 alpha level. To make sense of this, you can think of a monarch cruising over a cornfield. Because there's no more corn in agricultural fields, they can't find any place to lay their eggs. Then they come to a roadside. This might be the only habitat that's available for them to lay their eggs, and they would take advantage of that. The same goes for forest. Milkweed is not a very shade-tolerant species. It needs a lot of sunlight. So if a monarch were to fly through a forested area, it's likely going to use the roadside as a sort of highway between habitat patches, again, thus leading to a higher proportion or a higher density of monarch larvae. So in summary, the main finding from this study was that milkweed was present on most roadside transects that we studied. Again, just over 59% of roadsides that we sampled had milkweed. Now, this was lower than an Iowa study performed in 2009 and published by Rob Hartzler in 2010. They found that milkweed was present on 82% of roadsides. However, the diversity of milkweed that we found does suggest that there is promise for this. The success of Asclepias syriaca in roadsides relative to other species suggests that it is the best suited for survival on roadsides, and thus is a good candidate for inclusion in restoration efforts aimed at adding milkweed plants into roadside vegetation. However, the fact that it generally appeared to be a volunteer species, at least in the upper Midwest, suggests that consideration be given to management versus planting of new Asclepias syriaca plants. Although we did find comparatively high densities of two other species, Asclepias ovalifolia and Asclepias verticillata, these two species weren't present in many roadsides and thus would be good candidates. Because they're high densities when we did find them, they might be good candidates for inclusion in seed mixes in future restoration efforts. However, overall, it does appear that monarchs use roadsides less frequently than they use other habitat types. However, the mechanisms for this are still unclear. Perhaps they are less attractive to females for any number of reasons. Mowing, as Ken was just talking about, could either reduce milkweed habitat or even kill off monarch eggs and larvae as they try to grow in these habitats. Pesticides could still be having an effect on monarch growth in roadsides, as well as the ever-present threat of cars. If you're an adult monarch, it is not the easiest thing to cross in front of a semi. However, there is promise for roadsides increasing milkweed density in the Midwest and across the nation, but it may not be as valuable as other habitat types, and good practice would have us include these in future planning efforts, but not exclusively expect roadsides to completely bring back the monarch population. So that concludes my portion of the presentation. I think we are now open to questions. Wendy and Shelby, if you guys want to start firing away, I guess.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Ken, Karen, and Jennifer also for sharing your expertise with us today about monarchs and roadsides. We will get to the question and answer period in a little bit, but before anyone that needs to leave early logs off, I have a few housekeeping announcements that I want to make. We have recorded the webinar, and it will be available on both the NCTC and Monarch Joint Venture websites sometime in the near future. Our next webinar is currently scheduled for October 4th, so please join us that day. Also watch for registration information here in a few weeks, and that will be a webinar targeted for a youth audience, so a little bit different than we've done in the past. And lastly, we will follow up with today's webinar with a short survey and also some links that you saw throughout the presentation to more information. So we'd love to hear from you, your feedback about the webinar itself. So now we'll jump to a question and answer period. So I hope that you'll continue entering we've tracked some of the questions that have been answered throughout, but please ask questions in the chat box on the live stream, and we will try to get to as many questions as possible. Starting with a question for Xerces, but anyone feel free to chime in. Is there boilerplate language for informing local roadside policy?
Yeah, this is Jennifer. There isn't anything available that I know of, although I do want to draw attention to the links that are on the screen. Federal Highways has a lot of good resources regarding best management practices that can be shared, but in terms of policy, probably one resource I would look into is the Florida Native Wildflower Society has been working with counties in Florida to develop policies around reduced mowing to increase wildflower diversity, and they do have some policy language. Although it's specific to the situation in Florida, I think it's a nice case study of what might be applicable in other states.
Great. Anyone else have anything to add to that question? Otherwise, we can move on to my next question is, what's the best way to improve roadside habitat without starting from scratch?
Ken, do you want to address that one?
Sure. I would say probably one of the easiest approaches would be to just for road authorities to take a critical look at their mowing practices. I see a lot of mowing that gets done, and I can't draw a real clear objective out of some of the mower operators. So they might be mowing because they want to. They might just be mowing for aesthetics reasons. They might be mowing because they want to keep up with brush control, things like that, where it might not be the best use of time, and it's definitely therefore it might be an unnecessary impact on the habitat. That being said, it also depends on the roadside. If it's a roadside without many forbs to begin with no wildflower food source to begin with, changing that mowing isn't going to help a whole lot. But on roadsides where there are some forbs, if the mowing practice starts to change, those forbs they'll at least won't get mowed off, and they'll likely increase.
Great. As a follow-up do you feel overseeding is an effective means of increasing diversity on roadsides?
Not really. The weed seed bank on roadsides is horrendous. Our technology for planting native grasses and forbs was really developed working with agricultural fields, which start out fairly weed-free, and it's really tough in a roadside setting because of all the weed seed bank that you get, and also just because of the simple fact that most roadside vegetation, at least in the Midwest, is dominated by smooth brome, and it's really hard to see seedlings compete with a well-established stand of smooth brome. So there needs to be some kind of disturbance before planting.
Fair enough. Moving on, are there incentives or incentive programs that might better encourage participation in roadside habitat restoration for monarch? Don't everyone volunteer at once.
There are, I think, Adopt a Highway is starting to think about ways to work with partners to manage chunks of the road. So that might be an avenue to pursue.
Okay. We will maybe do some follow-up on that question, and if we can come up with a better answer, we'll distribute that by email. Now for an easier question on roadsides, Ken, so you're probably the best to answer this one. Is there a standard for roadside width or roadside right-of-way? And obviously that varies between different types of roads.
Yeah, it's going to vary a lot. A general rule of thumb is that on smaller highways, like county and township highways, a roadside will be around 30 feet wide. And then it usually gets bigger with bigger highways to where you might have roadsides on the interstate system of about 75 feet. And those are just rules of thumb. It just varies depending on the site, depending on how land was purchased and how dense the development was in any given area. But I would say roughly between 30 and 75 feet.
Okay, and now a follow-up question for our Monarch experts. Would you consider a minimum width of the roadside plantings that's recommended to be effective for Monarch?
Yeah, I don't think we really there really isn't a minimum. When Kyle did the study, Kyle, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, actually that model that I showed, including milkweed density and all the different adjacent land types, we included roadside width in that model originally to determine if it was a good predictor of whether or not there would be monarchs. and it was taken out in the first round of our backwards model selection, which would then indicate that no, there is no roadside width that specifically benefits monarchs. And in our study, we had roadsides ranging from 2 meters wide up to 30 meters wide, so a huge range, and still there was no trend for any roadside width being specifically better for monarchs.
This is Ken. That kind of makes sense too, because if you think about milkweed, it'll grow just about anywhere. And if you think about habitat width versus traffic mortality, Jennifer, I know you said traffic mortality was relatively minor, but narrower roadsides might mean less habitat, but those are also the same roads that have lower traffic volumes. So those will vary in sync with each other.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out here that there have been very few studies. There have been some studies, and Jennifer talked about those, but the traffic mortality is something that is really difficult to assess. So while it's been done a few times, it hasn't been done very much. So that's kind of a big hole in our knowledge.
Thanks, Karen. That addresses one of the other questions that came up. I'm going to ask at least one more question here. To your guys' the experience you've had working with roadsides or roadside managers, are there public perceptions associated with growing species like milkweed in roadsides, especially in agricultural areas where those species tended to be enemies to farmers for many years?
This is Ken. I'll start with that one. When we added common milkweed to our seed mixes, a few of our seed mixes, I think in 2009, and we double-checked all the county noxious weed lists around the state to make sure that nobody had them listed. Nobody did. And since we've added it, I've only heard from one person who called to complain. That was just a couple weeks ago. It was a very interesting conversation. But I talked to Department of Ag in Minnesota, and they very rarely hear complaints about milkweed. I think in general, agriculture, which has led to the problem with little milkweed, is that they're much more capable of controlling milkweed in their fields. The person who did call to complain was dealing with a pasture and hay system, so he had a little bit different constraints.
In my experience, when I was sampling, I had a couple farmers come up to me and wonder, what you're doing in my ditch. They were primarily concerned with keeping other invasive species out of their roadsides. When I would explain to them that I was there looking for milkweed, they would generally received a warm reception. Several farmers were more concerned about thistle species in their roadsides, so hopefully that gets at your point a little bit too.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I'm glad to hear the shift in behavior, attitude towards milkweeds, especially in agricultural areas. I think with that, we're after 2 o'clock here Central Time, so I think I'm going to wrap up the webinar for today. So thanks again to everyone. If we didn't get to your question, I apologize. Feel free to follow up with us afterwards by email. Thanks again to NCTC for hosting the webinar and everyone who participated today. So we hope to see you for our next webinar on October 4th.